Hi everybody, welcome to the Site Information lecture. It's the last lecture of the first module, and we're going to be talking about the information that needs to be gathered about a site that you might be designing an irrigation system for. And accurate site information is absolutely necessary in order to design an irrigation system that best fits the conditions of the area that you want to be watering. And now that you've got some understanding of soil, plant, and water relations, the next step is discussing the requirements of the property owner, the desires they have, and of course a budget for the irrigation system. The information gathered through site analysis includes measurements of the site, the development of some kind of a base plan of the site, notations about special conditions, soils, the type and source of water available, local weather conditions, and then hydrozones that are planned for the landscape. Now before beginning, you want to also be absolutely certain to check with local utility companies to locate any buried lines on the site. And it's best to minimize in your designs the crossing of utilities with irrigation system piping, and even more importantly to avoid locating any irrigation equipment on top of utilities. If you are in the state of Utah, then Blue Stakes of Utah locates utilities and they can be reached by calling 811, and I would strongly encourage this as I have learned about it the hard way. To get started, this is one example from the textbook of a design site data worksheet. You'll need something like this form to record the site information. Now this is just one example, but and it's a good start, but I would suggest perhaps coming up with something of your own, maybe an Excel based form, something like that, that you could easily fill and reuse over and over again. At the same time, you could easily copy this and use it over and over again as well. So making measurements, accurate measurements of the site are critical so that a scale drawing can be made if needed. Now it's not always needed, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But if it is, then you want to be sure that you take a sufficient number of measurements and that those measurements are accurate enough to create the scale drawing. You want to check that against any existing plan you might have to work with. And one good rule of thumb is that you want to take measurements to selected reference points. So things in the landscape that aren't going to change, that's what you want to utilize. Maybe a corner of a structure, a large tree, things like that that aren't going to change. You want to also note topography and elevation differences and grades, because those will be very important as you're designing irrigation because of how they affect hydraulics in the system. So here, this is just for your information, some typical shapes you might come across in a landscape and the calculations for determining the area of those shapes for your use. Now before going to the effort of creating a base plan yourself, you want to check to see if a plan already exists. If the owner isn't able to provide this, there might be a site plan or survey on record at the city or county planning and zoning department. And even if that plan doesn't have all the details you need, it could provide a good starting point as you develop your own base plan. Newer homes actually might even have a CAD drawing, computer-aided design drawing available, and larger sites almost always have some sort of existing site plan. On the other hand, if you can't obtain some kind of an existing plan, a scale drawing on graph paper is a good alternative, especially for really small sites. Now the shape of the area should be drawn on the base plan with all the sides and dimensions accurately measured, and then you want to take additional measurements to assist in drawing any curves and odd angled borders. And your landscape planting design, I'd say, is trending a lot toward those more oddly shaped areas. You want to locate all buildings, walkways, driveways, parking areas, and you can see all of that here, the residence, the driveway, this is the street out front. Perhaps any light and utility poles, retaining walls, stairways, any other features of the site, particularly those that won't be changing. And you want to indicate where there are slopes, in which direction they're going, how steeply the ground may be sloping, and also take note of any areas where water drift or overspray from sprinklers can't be tolerated. For example, windows that might be close to the lawn area. So if you do end up drawing your own plan, you might work from a plan you obtain, You might draw that by hand with correct dimensions, redraw it on graph paper to scale, and again include all the existing buildings and trees. Now, something else to consider are any special conditions that might be in place for the location of the property that you're working on. So, for example, there might be local codes relating to the materials that can be used, the equipment that can be used, and the installation methods. Certainly there are going to be some codes related to backflow prevention, and I'll talk more about that. But for example, in Logan, Utah, backflow prevention is absolutely required on a water system in a home, and you have to follow the existing codes. So it's best to check with the local code so you know exactly what you are able to do. There may even be other local codes. Cities sometimes have codes such as time of day watering, where they restrict that watering. Oftentimes in Utah, they restrict that watering to be outside the hours of 10 a.m. and 6 p.m. So there may also be other watering restrictions, perhaps day of the week, things like that. But those are the special conditions that might exist, and I'm certain there are others, but you should just be sure that you get as much information as possible from the owner and the local authorities as far as that goes when you are designing. Now, type and source of water, of course, is very critical. If the water source is from a pond or a stream, it's likely that that water will be pumped with the use of some kind of an electric pump. So you want to note that information. If the water source is a well, you want to note the well capacity and get any well data that might be available, flow rates and so on. For city water, you want to note the location, length, size, and type of service line from the city main to the meter. And that will become really important as we start talking about the hydraulics that you have to determine for your system. If it's possible, you want to obtain a working pressure or flow information from the city, or alternatively, you can perform your own flow test to determine available working pressure and flow. And that information is going to be critical because it's required to determine how much water is available and at what pressure for each of the irrigation zones you end up designing. And the amount of time required to irrigate an entire area, the type of sprinklers that are going to be used, flow rate and pressure, those are all going to be very dependent on the type and the source of water. So very critical information. Other information that's going to go into this collection of site information includes local weather information and also hydrozones that are planned. And if you think back to our plant water relations lecture, we talked about ET rates, and we talked about an example with the cool, dry climate, and that's where this local weather information becomes important. So local ET rates for the plant material to be irrigated, determining hydrozones, and hydrozones are usually served by one valve or control zone, so that's important for your irrigation system. And they may come from the planting plan, or they may come from an actual site survey. That just depends. You'll want to note plant height or potential height because your irrigation system, hopefully it's going to be designed for the longer term, and so you need to design for the mature plant material, not just what you put out there initially. You can also note the irrigation method for each hydrozone. So is it a spray irrigated area? Is it drip irrigated? Are there small rotors being used? And so on. Now, another thing to consider is the microclimate of the area. And with microclimates, they can be described in a lot of ways, but I like these fairly simple descriptions here. So an average microclimate would be a condition where things like buildings that are adjacent or pavement, slopes, shade, reflection don't influence the site and the irrigation or water use on the site. Now, on the other hand, you might have a high, what's called a high microclimate, where there are lots of heat absorbing or reflecting surfaces, maybe high wind that are affecting water use and your irrigation system. You might also have a low microclimate where the area is very shaded and wind protected, and so you might also have to consider that in terms of your design and irrigation scheduling. Now, other factors that you might consider The customer might have some preferences about, well, the customer's going to have preferences about a lot of things, but they might have a preference about the type of pipe being used. Certainly they're going to tell you, well, I'd like to have the irrigation controller here or there, and they're going to have reasons for that. They might have, they might desire a manual system. They might desire an automatic system. They might have other ideas about the types of sprinklers they would like to see used. And they might have, in the longer term, they might have future plans for that landscape. So it's a good idea for you to talk that over with them and understand whether you're designing for what's happening now and whether or not your design may need to be adjusted for something that might happen in the future. It's a really good idea to talk that over with them. They might decide that they want a certain number of hose connections or quick couplers around the property, and they might have restrictions as far as watering windows for the site. So, and by that I mean they can only irrigate every third day from 2 p.m. to 5 p.m., things like that. So those kinds of pieces of information will be really critical for you as you begin the design process. So, just as a quick example, again, here is the design site data worksheet that you might work from. Of course, again, you could always develop your own. And let's just say we were designing for this particular property, which, by the way, is an example that will be worked through over the course as a group as we begin this process. So this is actually a light commercial property, so there's an office building there, parking area here, but you can see a lot of things noted: trees that are existing, certain planting beds, shrub areas, things like that. So if you were filling in a site information data sheet for a property like this, you might end up with something like this amount of information. So you've got the name, the address, all of those particulars, contact information, also whether or not permits are required, soil type, so presumably you will have gone out and determined what the soil type is like. You'll know what the climate type is like based on where it's located, and then you can use some of the information we had in the plant water relations lecture to determine worst case daily evapotranspiration. Here's where the water source information is collected. So in the case of this example, it's city water, so information about the well and pumps and so on is not required. Water quality information also not required because city water is going to meet a certain minimum standard. Meter location as noted on the plan, meter size, and the type of service line and size coming onto the property. And then static water pressure measured at the meter here is noted as 65 psi, or pounds per square inch. We'll get a lot more into that stuff as we go on. Now finally, the hydrozones in this particular plan are described as turf between the road and the walkway. Sun exposure is full, so they prefer to have overhead irrigation. And in fact, they're preferring overhead irrigation for all of these different hydrozone areas, including large turf areas, small turf areas, large shrub beds, and small shrub beds. Okay, so this is the kind of information, again, that would be gathered for your site. So I'll leave you with a little bit of food for thought once again, and we will continue with Module 2 next week.